Hi everyone, this is Selena Kraus and welcome to another card video. In this video, I'm sharing few card ideas using the new My Monthly Hero kit for July 2020 from Hero Arts. So I have a couple of shaker cards and one standard non-shaker card. Also two ideas that one I shared on the Hero Arts blog yesterday. And the other one is very similar to the shaker cards here, so I didn't include it in the video. So here are the two cards that I won't show you how to make, but you can easily figure it out watching the video for the other three cards. So this is one of the Heroescapes stamp set. It comes with 3 layers and it's very easy to layer. You will notice that the first layer, the layer number 1, has like kind of empty spots where that layer 3 lines up. So you can have nice multicolored underwater scape. So you see that corals, the pink ones and the green ones, they're in the middle of the blue, and you can only achieve having those spots there. So I have my MISTIs. I have from the 2 cards I made, I already had lined up my layers, the 3 layers, 1, 2, and 3. And also I had some images that I've already stamped. Also in the stamp set, in the kit, not in the stamp set, it's included other smaller images, coordinating die, one standalone die for the ruins. We have coral, embossing powder, and the sparkle sticker cardstock. So let's take a look of the rest. So here we have the underwater pattern bold prints. We have the School of Fish bold prints that I'll be using. We have the deep sea background that coordinates with the peekaboo dies. We have Deeply in Love, Need a Hand, See You Soon, Deep Sea Messages, and we have some standalone dies. So for the shaker cards, I'm using the rectangle infinity dies. I'm using 2. I skipped one size in between. To create that frame, I'm using the largest, and the other one is about 3 3/4 wide. So I'm making that frame by taping those 2 dies together so I can cut equal, kind of identical frames. So before we move into cutting, let's stamp our Heroescapes, our underwater scapes. So I'm using the Reactive inks. Also 5 of these cubes come in the kit. So I'm starting with Pool Party, also comes in the kit. Blue Hawaii as well, Splash, Taffy, and Key Lime Fizz. So I'm stamping a couple times. I'm using my MISTI to make sure that I have nice coverage of that ink. I'll just do several of those and then we'll just die cut them. So I'm gonna skip the rest here and briefly we're gonna move to the layer number 2, and you will see how that layers. The layer number 2 layers directly onto the layer number, the layer 1. There are no empty spots, but it lines up with the coral reef on the sides. So I'm lining it up here, so you will see the algae and the corals kind of line up to the top, and also the coral reef, like the section and the fish under. So I'm just going to turn it around, do the same, and here I offset mine for like about 1/8 of an inch for my MISTI from the first and second layer. So I have full, so I didn't need to cut larger piece than 4 1/4, but it didn't really matter because I ended up cutting those to 4 inches wide and 3 3/4. So I could have put it all the way to the edge. So here I'm stamping with the Blue Hawaii. So now in the splash, this is the splash background. Again, I'm stamping with Blue Hawaii. And all the inks that I'm using today are reactive inks, except one that I'll use for stamping the mermaid. It will be the navy shadow ink. Again, I'm stamping a couple times to make sure that I have even coverage. Cleaning my stamp, and I'll put that pink layer that I use using the Taffy, and I'm using with the Berry Smoothie Reactive ink. Just making sure that that's lined up to on the side. Pressing nicely there. I'm stamping it one more time. I think this looks good. I'll just turn it around and repeat the process. So I find it easier if I stamp everything at once, kind of not going back and forth, and this way I ended up with a bunch of images that I can use for future projects when I need a card very quickly. So next we're going with the third layer and the last layer of that Hues cape, underwater scape. And I'm starting with the pool party background, and I'm using the Taffy, actually the Berry Smoothie ink for this. I'll turn it around, and now I'm using the Key Lime Fizz. I really like how the Key Lime Fizz looks with the pool and the pool party in the blue Hawaii. Next I'm using the splash background with the blue Hawaii, and I'm adding the Key Lime Fizz. On the other side, I'm gonna go with Taffy. This way you can have a bunch of color variations and all cards will look a little bit different. Next I have previously stamped this one. I didn't really like how it looked with a creamsicle. So I'm going to stamp with Watermark ink, and then I'll use the coral embossing powder that comes in the kit to cover up that creamsicle ink. So I stamp a couple times with embossing ink, just opening my coral. See here how we quickly change that color of the corals. And I think this looks better, and we're going to use this background to create our last card. So next we're moving to the last layer for the splash background, splash with blue Hawaii, and I'm using Key Lime Fizz for one side, and then I'll use the Taffy for the other side. Then we're going with the Taffy background, and I'll use blue raspberry and splash ink. So I'll do it one more time. Next we'll use the coordinating frame cuts to die cut all those underwater scapes. I just secured that too, and then the border die that's with the standalone with ruins. So here a bunch of cutout. I use different cardstocks for that border of ruins, along with the sparkly paper that comes in the kit. So here are all the ones that I did. And then there are the frames. I did 2 per card. I was going to create 3 shaker cards, but I only did 2 because the third one was going to be the same. So just save the 1 frame set for future use. So I'm adhering 2 by 2 frames. I'm using the Hero Arts precision glue, making sure they're nice and lined up. And then I'm putting a big acrylic block on top to make sure that they dry flat. I'm repeating that for the second and then for the last frame. I'm removing, I use purple tape to hold those dies while I cut in my die cutting machine. Again, I use that big acrylic block on top to make sure that dries flat. So now we're gonna start assembling our cards. So I'm using the Arctic cardstock. I have a piece of measuring 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm using the blue Hawaii and pool party inks to ink black ink blend the top of that. I decided to use a color cardstock because it's easier. You have extra one layer that already has color, so you need to do less blending. So I got a smidge of Blue Hawaii ink there on the left side, but it will get covered up with our layers. So my orange layer, it's die cut from Kiwi cardstock. And we're going to apply some ink, the Blue Hawaii and Pool Party ink on that to have some little bit kind of rustic or rusted look. So I'm just ink blending, and then I'm swiping the sea salt ink on the bottom. So I'm just adding a little bit more ink, and I think that looks fine. Next I'm going in my MISTI, and I'm going to use the School of Fish bold prints to stamp on the background. And I will stamp with the sea salt ink. It gives a very subtle white impression. So you can see they're already there, but I will stamp a couple more times to make sure that we have nice coverage and you can see it nicer. So I'm just kind of layering everything to see how everything will look like. I'm just pulling out which images I wanted to add. So I'm adding the little man with, well, I'm not sure if it's a little man, but the man with the trident, the mermaid, the dolphins. So for the dolphins first, I will stamp with Pool Party. And then on top of it, I'm going with the fog ink. So we are kind of changing that color. It's not really gray like fog gray, but it has blue undertones. And then for the mermaid and the guy with the trident, I'm using the navy shadow ink. I'm stamping a couple times to have nice coverage. And I will just die cut it with the coordinating dies. By magic of YouTube, we have those die cut plus extra die cuts for the other cards that we're going to stamp directly onto them using the MISTI tool. So now I'm adding some score tape on back of the frame, and I will add a piece of acetate. So this will be the window of the shaker card. So I'm adding 1/8 inch white tape. And now I have the Hero Art acetate sheets. I cut it a little bit smaller than 5 1/4 by 5 1/2. And now I have some excess on the side that I trimmed it out. I'm using my bone folder to make sure that it adheres pretty nicely. So I'm trimming my layers to 4 inches wide. But then I will trim them to fit under the window, because when we add that foam tape on the back of the frame to create the shadow, the shaker, it will kind of interfere with the layers. So I'm just measuring, and it came to be 3 3/4. So I'm trimming that down. I'm just trying to see here how I want everything positioned, whether in the shaker or top of the shaker. So I decided to go with all the layers in the shaker inside. So I'm using foam squares to adhere that underwater scape to the ruins border. And then we'll adhere it onto our background. Again, I will use the foam squares. But before we move on to that step, we're going to stamp the sentiment onto the background. So I'm just making sure that the background is nice and dry, so the embossing powder doesn't stick where it should not stick. I'm positioning all the elements. I think that looks good, and I'm going to use my MISTI because I'll stamp it a couple times to make sure I have nice coverage. I use the embossing buddy to prevent the embossing powder stick where it should not. I applied the white embossing powder, and now I'm just heat setting it. Now we can go ahead and assemble our card. So I'm using little foam squares to add the elements to the background. So the sentiment says, "Deeply grateful for you." Also, I'm adding the foam squares in the back of our layer. back of that ruins border. Removing the backing and adhering that onto the card. So I think that looks good. We're just gonna adhere the dolphins, again using the foam adhesive, the foam squares. So next I'm adding some ombre ocean and seaside sequins in the middle. I'll add 2 layers of foam tape on back of that frame. I have the 3/4 inch wide foam tape, so I'm trimming very thin strips to add around the frame. And I'm doubling them up so we have a higher, kind of thicker shaker, more space inside, because also we have 2 layers of foam squares inside the shaker. So we don't want all those layers to interfere with the shaker and with the sequins that's going to be shaking around. So here you can notice how I have everything along the sides. So I added here the last one layer of the last side, and then I'm trimming another one. I removed the backing and added one more on top. I'm using the anti-static tool on the ends, on the inside edges, so sequins don't stick. I'm removing the backing and adhering that, just pressing with embossing with my bone folder to make sure that it's nice and sealed. So the last step is just to adhere to a note card, and I'm using one of the Hero Arts top folding Dove White note cards. So with that, our first card is finished. Now let's move to the second card. We're gonna create again a shaker card, but this way we're gonna do a rays of sunshine coming through the water, and we're doing kind of pink purple background here. So I'm using the Berry Smoothie and Taffy ink pads to ink blend on the background, also on the ruins edge, like border. So I think that looks good. So now I'm using the sun background stencil to create the rays. The rays don't extend all the way down, so we're gonna do, once we ink blend that sea salt ink here, we're gonna remove the stencil, and using the post-it roll or post-it tape, I'm extending those rays and adding more sea salt reactive ink. So this is very easy to do. Since it's reactive ink, it's very easy to blend, and you don't really see that line that you had where those rays stopped before. So there's our background. Next, for the border, I'm adding some white shimmery iridescent spray to add a little bit of extra sparkle. I'm making sure that that background is dry before I stamp the sentiment. So I just added some embossing powder to make sure that it doesn't stick. So that means it did not stick. That means it's ready for stamping the sentiment. I'm stamping the Sending Oceans of Love sentiment. Again, I'm using the embossing and watermark ink, and I'll emboss in white, using white embossing powder. So I think that's good. Now I'm stamping the little bubbles using the sea salt reactive ink. Just stamping a few times. So next we're gonna add some of the elements, and I have here the negatives of the die cuts that we die cut before. So I'll use that to position the stamps and to stamp directly onto the die cuts. So I'm using the blue raspberry ink to stamp the fish, and the berry smoothie for the little seahorse. So I'm gonna stamp one more fish. We're gonna use 2 fish and 1 seahorse onto the card. So now I'm creating that shaker. Again, I'm adding tape on the back all around that frame, using the 1/8 inch of tape. Again, I will trim my offsetted sheet to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I press with my bone folder to make sure that we have that's it nice and adhered. We're trimming the layers to 3 3/4. like we did on the previous shaker card. I'm adding the foam squares in the back, and I'll adhere those two layers together. So compared to the previous card, we're not gonna pop up that border, like orange border on another layer of foam squares, but instead we're gonna adhere it using the Hues Precision Glue. So now I'll add the little elements, the fish and the seahorse, using the foam squares. And next on the tape, on the frame, we're gonna add 2 layers of foam tape all around, making sure there are no gaps so sequins don't escape. So now we can add the sequins in the middle. I'm using the ombre ocean and the ombre purple sequins, and I'll adhere that frame on top. So last thing that's left here is again to adhere this shaker onto a note card. Again, I'm using Hero Arts Dove White Top Folding Note Card. So let's move to the last card. I just wanted to show you a card using that coral embossing powder. So I'm using Arctic cardstock for the background, and I'm using Splash, Blue Hawaii, and Pool Party ink to blend that background. I'll use the same colors to the layer here, the ruins layer. I cut 2, one from vellum, one from silver holographic paper, but I decided to go with the vellum. So towards the bottom of the layer of the cardstock, I decided to just go directly with my ink pad to the cardstock, so it creates kind of more textured look for the sea. I'm just adding also some ink onto the vellum. First I thought I'll go on the back side, but the vellum is kind of thicker, so I went on the front to get the effect that I like. Then I just wiped the sea salt embossing reactive ink on the bottom of that panel. So now we're gonna go with the School of Fish bold prints, and again sea salt ink to stamp onto our background. So I'm stamping a couple times. I'm gonna make sure that that's nice and dry. We have quite a few layers of ink there, especially with the swiping motion of the ink pad. So now we're gonna go and stamp the sentiment. I'm using the same sentiment from the previous card, sending you oceans of love. And next we're gonna do again direct stamp to die cut technique using my Hero Arts Mini MISTI tool. I'm stamping the mermaid using the Blue Hawaii ink. And then the dolphins using Pool Party, and then stamping with fog to have kind of blue undertones. So next we're gonna do the little seahorse. Here my layer of my negative moved, so the seahorse came a little bit crooked, so I just fixed that one and restamped it again and embossed it with coral embossing powder. So I think that looks good, and I'm restamping it again using embossing ink, dipping it in the embossing powder and heat setting it. So now we can go ahead and assemble our cards. I'm trimming my layer to kind of the layering pieces to 4 inches wide. Also, I'll trim the layer to 4 inches wide by 5¼ inches tall. I'm spraying that mermaid using the white iridescent shimmer spray. I'm just assembling my card now. Added the first layer using just regular tape, and the second reef using foam squares. I'm adding the dolphin, the mermaid, the seahorse using foam squares again. So we're almost done here. I'll just, to finish it off, I can either use fun foam, or here I'm using the foam tape to adhere it to a note card. Again, I'm using a top folding Dove White Hero Arts note card. So here's one more look of the cards that we made today. And thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you can find all the supplies that I used today in the description below. Thanks for watching. Bye!